So next up we have Jessica Lord. I'm so excited that Jessica could come and speak here today, traveling all the way across the country from New York. Even though she did, used to reside here back in the day when Jessica worked at GitHub. Chances are you've used some application that Jessica's sticky fingers were involved in making along the way. Jessica led the Electron team, or started the Electron team at GitHub. And so, if you've been working on anything that's been built as a desktop application that uses JavaScript, HTML, CSS, all of those good things packaged up and used on the desktop app, there are lots of them around. Are we going to? Oh, we're going to lunch. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for your talk, Jessica.
Thank you.
So you may well have encountered Jessica's work already. Also, Jessica now works in New York at a company called Splice, who do kind of tooling and resources for musicians. Heard it described as GitHub for musicians, so the mind kind of boggles there. I've seen Jessica talk a bunch of times before, and always really enjoy her take on culture and the way teams work together. And so I'm very, very excited to be able to welcome them here to JAMstack conference. Please make her very, very welcome. It's Jessica Lord.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Phil. Thank you. As Phil said, my name is Jessica Lord. I work at a company called Splice in New York City. I work on the back end and a bunch of very not jammy stuff at all. But I'm not talking about any of that today. Today I'm going to share some stories about very jammy things I worked on when at GitHub and at Code for America. And GitHub is a code sharing site. And Code for America, if you don't know, is a nonprofit based here in San Francisco for writing open source software for city governments that city governments can use and be better at governing. But first, I want to go into this statement and really why I'm thrilled to be here and a part of the JAMstack Conf and really love this area of the web the most and excites me is because I really truly believe that everyone is a developer, that everyone could be a developer, that everyone might be a developer. They might be on their way, they will be a developer soon, or they actually already are a developer, but they're afraid to call themselves that. Our profession is really special that way. For those of us who do this professionally, it's different that we actually have people not doing it professionally, doing the stuff that we do professionally. That's different. It's not like rocket science or heart surgery, and I don't mean in terms of complexity, right? Because that's not to say that the work we do isn't important, revolutionary, remarkable. It is, and that's what's really exciting for me about it. And it's not to say that there aren't really brilliant people doing amazing things, but you don't need to be on the bleeding edge fringe of web development to make something meaningful and empowering. And there aren't heart surgery hobbyists. There actually might be, and it's definitely illegal. But it's one of these ways in which our profession is different than other people's. And I might really regret this metaphor later, so we'll see. Because unlike heart surgery, the web is bigger than what we do professionally. And unlike heart surgery, the web is better when it's approachable for more people. The work we do every day is also done by tinkerers, by activists, by people on their weekends, by people teaching themselves, by community leaders, all these people who aren't considering themselves a professional developer. They're still using the tools that we have built and contributed and are using. But I think it's important that when we build the tools we do and create the environments we do for web development, we think about these tools in the context not just of other developers exactly like us, but for people, not developers. But aren't developers people? Yes. But they're a subset of people who could, would, and should be developing. And so for me, and why I love the JAMstack and a lot of the work I do is because I want to build things so that there's more people building things. And I think it inflates everyone. It is better experience on the web when more people can use the web. There's this quote I love from Anil Dash, who is the CEO of Glitch, formerly Fog Creek, but now fully in on Glitch. It seems more important than ever to encourage a diverse community of creators to experiment with their broadest set of ideas. I think that's so true, and to me, it's really important because coding is a powerful literacy, and it's not just the broadest people out there who might be developers or who aren't developers, but I mean, it's also the people you work with, because you probably work with people who aren't developers, or people who haven't been developers their whole lives, or people who are developers but came from a totally different stack than what you're working on now. And so I think it's really important that we don't think of a professional developer as the only kind of developer, and that everyone can benefit from building things on the web. Because HTML, CMS, and JavaScript, they still work. And like Monica has showed us, browsers do amazing things. Like, we have these tools already, and it kind of doesn't need to be more complex than that. So where's my screen? I have this kind of scale of web things where if you imagine the two extremes of a single page site and then a really big web app, I think we focus on this far end and we make it seem like this is web development. This is where you need to be putting stuff online. And it's just not true. There's all this spot and space in the middle. And I've actually used this diagram before, but now it's really clear to me that this is the jam spot of things. And so this is the area full of things you can do that don't have to be super complex, and I want there to be more activity here. Because sometimes our projects make it out into the world and other people interface with them, and those other people need less overhead, and then sometimes a project doesn't. It stays internal, but your teammates need less overhead too. All right, the first part is the story of making an Electron a thing. Electron is a library that GitHub maintains that is for building desktop apps that work on Mac, Windows, and Linux using web technology. But it used to be called Atom Shell, and it was a dependency in Atom, which is GitHub's text editor. And it lived there, and GitHub didn't want to do anything with it. There was no vision for it. There was no plan. And I had been at GitHub and recently had moved on to the Atom team, and as I dove deeper into the Atom code and onboarded and learned that the thing making everything happen was this thing called Atom Shell, I started to think it was actually more game-changing than Atom itself. I think Atom is a great text editor, but Atom Shell felt really game-changing to me, and so I started to fight for it. And you might be surprised that there was pushback, because there was really no vision for this to ever be anything. Like, Atom was the dream, and there was just like there was no plan for this. And I kept pushing, and I wrote up road plans and reasons why it should be its own thing. And I finally, as the first step, got the okay to spend my full time working on Electron stuff and the stuff that I had put on my roadmap. And so Atom Shell, the core library that is now Electron, was built and maintained by a guy named Chang, and so he still worked on the core library, and then I worked on all this other stuff that I had put on my roadmap as a sort of like proof to GitHub that Electron could be a thing that was worthy and stand on its own. And the first thing I started with was documentation. I wanted there to be one source of truth, and luckily there was already pretty good documentation in the Electron project. But I didn't want to overcomplicate that. I wanted there to be one source of truth for documentation. I wanted to standardize it with a style guide because it needed standardizing. And I wanted to make the most of Markdown and CSS and HTML. I've been on projects that have, like Adam, where documentation is this whole other thing. It lives in another repo. It's dependent on a whole other tool chain for documentation and a whole other templating library. And there's a whole other hurdle into onboarding just to fix the documentation. And I wanted to make the most of what exists now, which I felt was good enough. And then, of course, a static site generator. I was at GitHub, so I used Jekyll. And what I ended up doing was the Electron documentation lives inside of Electron, the repo. And so whenever you download Electron, you get a copy of the documentation. It's all Markdown. And so I wanted to start from there. That is the one source of truth. All changes to documentation happen there. And then so I never learned Ruby at GitHub, so I put a bunch of node scripts into my Jekyll site that basically took the tar file from an Electron release, would stream out the docs folder, read the file path, read the content of it, which had now been standardized, so it was predictable, and then generate the front matter and all the things that Jekyll needed so that it could then take all of those things, stream them out of the repo, and then put them nicely into a Jekyll site in the way that Jekyll wants them. And so yeah, like I mentioned, the style guide was really important so that the format of the documentation could be predictable, so that incoming changes could maintain the same format, and also because of wanting to make the most of CSS, knowing that I was going to be putting it on this Jekyll site, and I would have the benefit of CSS, so it could make the legibility of the documentation a little bit better than just reading the Markdown files. And so the style of all the documentation had to be really thought through and predictable. And so on the documentation on the site, there's also a few things that are a little bit Electron specific, but because it's pulling the docs from the releases of Electron, we get to have versioned documentation on the site. And then there's a TLDR line on all of the pages, because I feel like documentation, oftentimes you go to the page and you have to read through 2 long paragraphs to even figure out if you're on the right page or not. So I wanted people to have, right at the start, a place to go and know if they're in the wrong place or not. And then Electron blurs the lines between what's front end and what's back end, and then introduces new complexity with having 2 processes. And so there's a main process and a renderer process. And so each of the documentation tells what process it belongs to. And then because when we're on the site and we have the power of CSS to improve readability, we can do things like make it more clear when a method or an event is something that only happens on a Mac system or a Windows system. But it's really important to do this without forsaking the original Markdown, because I didn't want to do something so that it looked good on the site but then was horrible to read as Markdown, because the Markdown is the source of truth and it's what ships with every download of Electron. And so everything that had to be done, like pushing the limits of Markdown and thinking about how I'm going to style this in CSS, but have it not look terrible in the Markdown. And so that was the bulk of the documentation. The next thing I worked on was what was going to be people's first Electron app. And there are some other people at work who were like, of course, we'll do an Electron init and it should be a scaffolding system. And I pushed back on that. First of all, Electron apps can be anything. They can be a menu bar app that does one tiny thing with a window this big that tells you the time or the weather. It can also be Slack. So there's a huge gulf in the kind of Electron apps you can build. Not to mention, you can pick your flavor of front-end framework and all of this stuff. And so I felt like that's a huge undertaking to build a scaffolding tool that's going to support all these permeations of an Electron app. And even if it doesn't support all of them, then who are we to say, like, well, we think you should use React? We don't. And if you have a tiny menu bar app, like, you don't need any framework at all. And so I went with the keep it simple approach, and you clone it. It's a bare bones Electron app with an almost empty starting window. You clone the repo, you npm install, you npm start, and you get an almost blank Electron app. You can open up the dev tools and you can start to poke around in it. And you can, especially I wanted to think about people who weren't coming from the desktop app space, because people who are already in this space, who are maybe working at a startup that used like Chromium embedded framework and things like this, they already got it. So I don't care about them. Like, I care about the people who were front-end developers or people who didn't think that they could ever build a desktop app. I wanted people to know that in Electron, it's HTML. You can open it up, you can use the Chrome dev tools like you're used to and start doing the things that you already know how to do. And so with this little easy to clone and launch app, you like very instantly, almost instantly, it's not that instant, you can start digging around and changing an Electron app. But I wanted to go beyond that because it still was really hard to get across to people, what is Electron? Why would I use it? What are the kind of things that I can do with it? And so the next thing I did was build an Electron app that demos the Electron API. And I think it worked out really great. It was actually a really good tool for this, so that you can download this app and you can go through it and you can view the demos of the different kind of common things that you would do interfacing with the different desktop system UIs, and demo things like opening a new window, and so that it makes really clear like what this stuff means, like what's a dialogue. If you're not coming from the desktop application world, like you might not know exactly what a native dialogue is. So this app lets you go in and start actually seeing these things in real time. And I also wanted this app to be a learning tool inside and out. And so the code itself is structured in a way where everything is organized and named so that you can match it up. So when I mentioned earlier about there being the two processes in Electron, here when you open up the code for the app, you can find exactly the name, the matching name for a feature that happened, and find the corresponding renderer and main process files. And because it's an Electron app, and because we have Node available in our HTML, what each page does is actually uses all of the sample code the app gives you is the code itself. So we use Node to read the file and then append it to the DOM. And so there's also one source of truth here. So once you update the app's code, the demo app is updated. They're not ever going to be out of sync. And so that was huge for me, being one person doing a bunch of this stuff. And so that is essentially all of the groundwork that was done. And to me, the JAMstack was essential. Like, keeping it simple from the start was essential so that I could advocate for the project, so that I could actually build these things, so that I could maintain these things. And it was easy to onboard people once it became a real team and we got more people on it. It was easy to grow from there. You might find yourself in a position like this too. So it's not always an altruistic thing of like, I'm doing this for the good of humankind, but you might find yourself in a position where you need to maintain less and onboard people faster. All right, so the second part is about spreadsheets, something I love to talk about. And this goes back to my background is actually urban design and architecture, and I was an urban designer at the City of Boston in the Urban Design Technology Group. And from there, I went to do the Code for America Fellowship, which I mentioned earlier, for building open source software for city governments. And something I took with me from City Hall into this fellowship was a real desire to make it so that people could edit their own content, so that there wasn't this bottleneck places where IT had to do everything, because I felt like the web was further than that. The web was at a place where people shouldn't be so afraid to edit their own content. And so after that year and a grant from Mozilla, I ended up with a little library called Sheetsy.js for visualizing Google Spreadsheets on a website. But I'm not going to go into Sheetsy really. I just want to talk about how great spreadsheets are. And so back to this diagram again, and I think this space is such a great space for spreadsheets because spreadsheets are a database with no setup that almost everyone already knows how to use. And if you just sit with that for a second, like how many libraries, like we talk about all the hurdles of learning the modern web stack and all the tool chains and all of this stuff, and even if you're already a developer, you have to onboard into a new system and learn how everything works. And so something that exists with no setup and you don't have to teach people how to use it, that's amazing. And so I am mostly talking about Google Spreadsheets here when I say spreadsheets, but really a lot of the stuff you could do, if your spreadsheet is in Microsoft Office on Excel, like if you can get it to JSON, you can still do a lot of these things. So websites, they have problems. And so even if you're a professional developer who knows how to do all of this stuff, there are certain projects where these become hurdles even for you, and they're hurdles for people who aren't full-time developers. And spreadsheets make a lot of this easier or not a problem at all, especially when you think about, am I going to have a collaborator? Am I going to be working with someone who's not a developer? And that's one of my favorite things about spreadsheets is because they are so approachable that people are using them to do radical, awesome things in the very scary times in which we live. And so I think there's so much untapped potential about what we can do that involves so many people with spreadsheets. Okay, one library I want to talk about is called Tabletop.js, and Tabletop basically gives you the data you would expect from the Google API, which the Google API doesn't give you. If you use it directly to get your spreadsheet stuff, you get a bunch of extra stuff that you don't want. And so Tabletop cleans that all up for you and returns your columns and your cells to you as JSON in a way that seems reasonable. And it's on NPM. You can also just use it client side. It's on a CDN. And it's pretty simple, but it has some options. So you can use multiple sheets if your spreadsheet has multiple sheets. You can also only use some of the sheets if you have multiple sheets. You can use an auth key, so you don't necessarily have to make your spreadsheet public for everybody. You can use proxies. And so it is a great and handy library. And I loved that, because sometimes I feel like I'm just the spreadsheet-loving person in my own corner. And the docs for Tabletop say, like, imagine it's a read-only JavaScript CMS that you can edit through Google Docs. It's like Christmas or any other gift-giving celebration up in here. And that's how I feel, at least. And I want to be clear that I'm not talking about using a spreadsheet to just make a website that's a better designed table or a grid of cells. Because once you have it as JSON, all your data, you can go wild with your CSS and do whatever you want and represent it in really cool ways. So this, for example, is a tool lending library site. And if you use a Google form, you also can, one, prevent people from messing up your spreadsheet, if that's a concern. But you can also make it even more approachable to people if you don't want people to have to look at a spreadsheet. A Google form will feed into a spreadsheet, and then you can hook that spreadsheet up to a website. And there's also no deploying. Like, anytime someone visits your site, they're getting the latest from the spreadsheet. And that's fantastic. You can do mapping. You can turn your spreadsheet data, if you have Latin long data in your spreadsheet, you can turn it to GeoJSON, which Sheetsy will do for you. You can also go to geojson.io if you want to learn more about that format. But then you can feed your spreadsheet data into Mapbox maps or use Leaflet or Google Maps. You can also just avoid other libraries altogether and just use query strings. And this isn't just for mapping, but anybody that has a query string that matches the data you have, you can start using. And then you can do totally static data too, which I have done for projects. If you have a spreadsheet that isn't going to change that often and doesn't have that many editors, you might want to do this. You can use the version of tabletop in Node to pull down the spreadsheet JSON, write it to a file, and then use it as static data with your site. And you can also use it to back up things that way. There's also a site called If This Then That that lets you turn like almost anything you do today into data on a spreadsheet. And what I like the most is that you can kind of have your own copy of your data, essentially. And like there could be another discussion because technically it's like on Google and I don't know the legalities of that, but in a way, you have your own data. And so you can do things like totally display your social media in the way that you want, or just archive it. Like you will have a copy of everything you've done. And a space that I think is also really interesting and to me could just expand is the spreadsheet as a CMS, right? Like a spreadsheet can be a CMS. You could write blog posts in a spreadsheet. You could have CSS properties saved in a spreadsheet, and it can all feed and alter to a website. And lastly, I wanted to just mention the site Glitch, which Monica mentioned too. If you have not played around with Glitch, it is a great way to put your projects in a space where people can avoid a dev setup, can just go straight into your code, start playing with it, and making their own version of it. And so it's a really approachable onboarding experience for people. I have the spreadsheet URL on Glitch, so that's mine. But check out Glitch. And lastly, I hope that these have been some interesting ideas and that you think about keeping it simple from the start, because you might be in a position where it benefits you to keep it simple from the start. It will benefit your teammates, and it will benefit the people outside too as we grow this space for all the people who don't think they are developers, but they are, because everyone is a developer. So, thank you.